Hello to all of the students who are coming to Davenant to do religious studies. My name is Mr. Midgley. I'm one of the religious studies teachers for A-level, and this video is going to give you something of an introduction to what it's like to be here in our department at A-level and the kind of topics that we're going to cover. So I will talk about a few of those after you have heard from some students of yesteryear talking about their experiences of religious studies at Davenant. This is like the panel of A-level students, and these are the kind of things they were talking about. So let me just ask you guys, do you think that when you die, your soul leaves your body and goes somewhere else, like to some external realm?
Well,
you go first.
there's two ways of thinking about this. You have dualism and monism. A dualist would say that our mind and bodies are two separate entities, and when we die, our bodies stay on Earth while our minds or our soul go elsewhere. Maybe the earliest dualist I can think of is Plato.
All right, someone else tell me what monism is. Any of you, Michael, Georgianne, what's monism?
Monism is the belief that your soul is actually separate. No, have I got that right?
No, you might get that right at all.
I haven't cut that down. Monism is opposite to dualism in that there is only one physical world, not two distinctions between where our soul is currently and then where it goes in the afterlife.
Good.
So rather than it being separate and going on somewhere else, it actually stays in one place. There isn't a distinction between a world during life and then a world after death.
All right, okay, here's another question then. Georgianne, go on, all right.
But if you're a monist, it
Yeah.
doesn't mean that you necessarily believe that there is nothing after death,
Okay.
because there is also the belief that maybe you die within your physical body, but you are left in a restful state until you are resurrected when Jesus comes back.
All right, so that's a bit of the Christian stuff, isn't it? Which leads me into my next question, Georgianne, thank you. Which is, does God exist? Is there a God?
This is probably the most challenging question you get.
And the awkward one. Everyone gets angry.
I think there's lots of things to consider, isn't there? Like at the moment, looking at religious language, for example, you start of call into question whether to say he exists is even meaningful in itself.
Yeah.
And you kind of, like we did last year, you looked at a lot of his characteristics. Is he all powerful? Is he all loving? And you try and explore a little bit, if he is actually there.
Yeah, and that question can have lots of different answers, because it could be...
Well, surely there's only two answers, either he does or he doesn't, Joe, surely?
Well, yeah, but you could say, can God exist? Look at the Big Bang Theory.
Right.
Or you could say, can God exist? Look at all the evil in the world.
All right, okay. So there's ways of phrasing the question, yeah?
Was it the design argument we looked at last year, where you if you look at the universe, it's so kind of complex and well made up. There must be a designer, someone to have started it all off. Is that person God? Is it someone else?
I think this question is when your own beliefs get really picked apart, because you all come into this class either believing or not believing, and I think you'll find many philosophers who will pick at the smallest things possible to break away whether God can exist, and it does then come down to you having to think of both sides and question your own belief, and then hopefully you'll find the answer in yourself.
All right. Here's another question, kind of separate from the syllabus stuff, but how do you find studying philosophy and ethics? Is it difficult? Or can you understand things fairly quickly? Because you three are just coming off the back of a lesson with me where I've just been talking at you for an hour, some stuff on the board that it's difficult to explain, isn't it? Especially with the religious language. So is it easy to learn this stuff at A-level?
It's not so much easy, but
it's challenging.
It is challenging, and
sometimes when people say challenging, though, what they just mean is it's too hard.
No, it takes a lot of thought, and the good thing about it is it allows you to see things differently, because before I did philosophy and ethics, I didn't really think of questions like, is God real? Or is abortion wrong? I didn't really see them as, I thought saw them as quite trivial.
Yeah.
But once you study them and you look into what things actually mean, you can think about them in much more depth and with much more effect.
Sure.
I think as well, a lot of what we do study is stuff that we've already thought about. Like,
A lot is relevant.
even though you don't always sit there thinking like, oh my goodness, is my life got any purpose, and is God real? You don't, like, I'm not trying to say that's all that's on your mind when you're a teenager, but it does cross your mind, like, what does happen when you die, and is there going to be something after death? So I think they're meant to be challenging, because I don't think you're meant to have like definitive answers at the ages of like 16, 17 and 18, because we haven't even lived life yet. But it's challenging in a good sense, because I think even if you don't come out of the course with the definite answers of the purpose of life, you do come out with a broader mind and a more open view on other people's views, and it does prepare you to be able to look at things in later life.
All right.
I think you have to think a lot more at A level. You know, GCSE you can be kind of spoon-fed a lot of the material, but you have to start thinking a lot more, especially with some of the big ideas. But I think perseverance is key, because some ideas you may take to, but other ideas you may sit there and go, I don't get that. And a lot of people fall down because they'll kind of dismiss it and not try and understand it. But if you persevere with it, you'll eventually get your head around it.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I was teaching a lesson the other day, and a couple of students were like, I just don't get this at all. And it was a passage they were reading. And I've probably said to you guys before, and I had to say to these guys, you have to read things like 2 or 3 times, if not more sometimes. And you're not used to that, are you? Because you're used to just reading something once and being able to understand it.
But I think that the fact that you have to think a lot is not at all a bad thing.
Oh, no.
Because that's what philosophy is. It's thinking outside the box. You're not just looking at what's in front of you. You're thinking about what's beyond it.
And as Michael says, it involves perseverance.
Yeah.
It does involve challenge, and you will come out and be as well-rounded an individual as these 3 in front of me. Thank you very much, you 3.
No problem.
The place I want to start this, really following on from that, is to look at how an A-level in religious studies is regarded by universities. As you heard those 3 young people mentioning just there, it is a challenging subject. Sometimes you might have to read things more than once to be able to completely get it. But that's okay. And actually, it's attempting challenging work that means that the A-level you get is ultimately so respected by the universities. What Trinity College Cambridge do on their website, I think they still do this, is they publish a list of the most highly regarded A-level qualifications. It's worth saying with this that if you're doing a subject that is not on this list, it doesn't necessarily mean that that is a less well-regarded subject, particularly if you want to go on and study that subject at university. But you can see there that for Trinity College Cambridge, on their generally suitable arts A-levels for study, their religious studies is one on the list, along with your classics, your economics, languages, and English and so on. And then the science is up at the top there. So it's a highly credible, venerable subject, is religious studies, and you get a lot from it. The A-level experience, though, of RS is very different from what your probable experience at GCSE or Key Stage 3 levels. We split the exam and therefore the course into 3 modules: the philosophy module, the ethics module, and the module on developments in Christian thought. The developments in Christian thought module is one that's only recently been added to the course, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and that is looking in a fairly in-depth way at Christian theology particularly. So if you're coming to the course as somebody who has an existing Christian commitment, that really is the section that's been added in the last 3 or 4 years. Very helpful for thinking through some of those things. And then, of course, you've got the broader philosophy of religion, and then those questions of religious ethics to be dealt with across the 3 modules. It's very different, again, as I say there, from learning about religions that you might have done in Key Stage 3, learning about what festivals they have and so on, and then looking at what different religions think about X, Y, or Z that you would have done at GCSE. It is more in depth. It is harder work. So philosophy of religion, this is the first of 3 areas of study, and it covers ancient Greek philosophy, ideas about body and soul, ideas about God, ideas about how we should understand the world. And I've put at the bottom of these slides some typical questions that you might get from these topics. Is there another level of existence outside our own? How do we know what the essence of a thing is? What do we mean when we're talking about something's essence or substance? How do we decide what something is for? How do we decide what its purpose is? And we look at what thinkers like Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, Epicurus and so on would have to say about those issues. We also look at some of the classic arguments in favour of the existence of God. Obviously, a typical question here is going to be, does God exist? As I asked those young people in the video. And how can God's existence be proved? Are there some arguments for God's existence that are better than others? And you will decide that. We look in particular at these 3, the so-called ontological arguments, as well as cosmological arguments and teleological arguments for the existence of God. Again, those of you who've studied this at GCSE will be familiar with the cosmological arguments and the teleological arguments, not, as I say, in the depth to which we will go at A-level, but you will have some background in this. And of course, in order to do proper A-level work on these arguments, we must criticise them too. We must not just say what the arguments are for God's existence, but we must say whether those arguments work and what it is that we find persuasive or convincing or unpersuasive and unconvincing about those arguments for God's existence. We'll go into the problem of evil. We'll look at the so-called inconsistent triad, the idea that if you've got there are 3 propositions, aren't there, about this? So there's the idea that God is omnipotent, the idea that God is omnibenevolent, and the idea that evil exists. Those are 3 ideas. So God's omnipotence, God's omnibenevolence, and evil's existence. And yet those 3 things cannot all be true at the same time, says the problem of evil. That's the inconsistent triad, a triad of statements, God's omnipotent, God's omnibenevolent, evil exists, that don't go together, that they're inconsistent. And that presents us with the classic problem of evil. So we talk about that on the course as well later on in the year. And we look at what a theodicy is. And when I ask students later on in the year what a theodicy is, those of you who've watched this video will be able to say, well, a theodicy is an attempt to defend God against the problem of evil. You can see some typical questions at the bottom of the slide there as well. On to religious ethics, so that the second of the 3 components. There are other philosophy units, by the way. I'm just giving you a taste, a flavour of some of the topics that you may cover. And I'll do the same here. So in religious ethics, the kind of thing you will look at is big names like Thomas Aquinas, when looking at natural moral law, asking whether morality is something that is innate within us or whether it's something that we decide on situationally as per the utilitarians. You can see at the bottom there people like Bentham and Mill, who will argue that the best thing to do in any situation is the most useful one, the one that causes the greatest good for the greatest number of people. We'll also look at other ethical theories. So we have the ethics of Immanuel Kant pictured there on the top right, who thought that we could reason our way to the right choices using something that he called categorical imperatives. So as you can probably sense, there's a heavy emphasis on learning a lot of terminology, learning about a lot of the great thinkers of the past and understanding their ideas and being able to evaluate their ideas. Someone like Joseph Fletcher, that you can see there at the bottom, he's a slightly more recent thinker who was responsible for a theory called situation ethics, and he was asking whether or not Jesus's example might be a useful one to consider when we make ethical decisions. Now, all of these things, so these guys here, Aquinas, Bentham and Mill, and then Kant and Fletcher, all they're doing is they're giving you ethical theories, if you like, frameworks from which to decide how we behave morally when we're confronted with a given problem. But we also have to look at ethical issues, including all of the kinds of things that you might have talked about at GCSE, whether that be ethics of sex and relationships, business ethics, medical ethics, things to do with end-of-life care and euthanasia, and so on. These are all going to be covered at A level. And what you would do is you would then apply these ethical theorists' ideas to these problems as you look at those at A level. The final component, so the final of the three components in the course, is developments in Christian thought. And we begin that looking at Jesus Christ. Seems an appropriate place to go, but asking questions about his identity. Who was he? Of course, Christians would claim that the Bible justifies a belief that Jesus was God himself. But other people have said Jesus was not God. He was a remarkable person who would stand in the prophetic tradition. He was a prophet, or he was a social or political revolutionary. And of course, there are some people that would say, no, Jesus was just mad. Okay, he was somebody who was not to be paid attention to. And you will decide from the evidence what you think about Jesus. We look as well at Augustine. Some of you will have heard of Augustine. If you haven't heard of him yet, you will certainly have heard of him by the time the course finishes. He is a big name, one of the most influential thinkers in the whole of Christian history after the times of the Bible. So some of those questions there, what influenced Augustine's thinking? Why is he such a big deal? They will kind of be answered as you understand a bit more about him. But one of the things Augustine deals with is whether humans have the capacity to save themselves. And that begs questions for us, doesn't it? Such as, what do we need to be saved from? Is there a real problem with our lives from which we need to be saved? And Augustine has ideas on what the problem of all humanity is and how humanity can be saved from its problems. Within the theology section, the developments in Christian thought section of the course, we also look at how Christians ought to behave. Should they ever behave in a way that disobeys their government? And to do that, we take a long look at the life and work of the German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was very much involved in resistance to the Nazi regime during the Second World War. And we look at whether Bonhoeffer was right in the things that he said, or whether there are good arguments for not doing the things that Bonhoeffer suggested. He was a pacifist, incidentally, so he's saying that we shouldn't have fought in the war, but neither should we have allowed someone like Hitler to gain the traction that he got in the Second World War, so that he was in a position to be conquering other nations. So that's the content of the course in brief. There's actually, as I said, more than that, but those are just some flavours of the kinds of topics that we cover. If I've just shown you maybe 11 or 12 of them, there are, I think, 33 topics in total. So those are just some of the things that you will study. Consequently, if you're not interested in those topics, then consider changing to another subject. But I dare say that if you've got this far with it, you know that for everything there that you didn't quite understand or found a bit confusing, there are plenty of other things that you do have some ideas about and you want to get your teeth into. And maybe you're confident enough to realise that even the things you don't understand, you will get taught here at Davenant, and you'll get taught them well. We have a long-standing department here who've been teaching this subject for a long time, many years, since before many of you were born. So we look forward to being able to share that same level of experience in teaching this subject with you. There's no coursework to RS. It's assessed entirely on exams, but you will have essays throughout the year after every unit, which will be formatively assessing you, and you'll get feedback on how you're doing. But essay technique is something that we talk about quite a lot, and it's particularly useful if you are self-motivated to ask your teachers how to improve your essay technique. For those of you thinking about where this takes you, you can see them. You guys can read. You can see in that third paragraph on your screens where religious studies might take you. It is a hard subject to do at A-level, but that means that it provides the foundation for studying things that are equally hard at degree level. So anybody who wants to go and study law should have an A-level in RS, maybe even in preference to an A-level in law. They should also study, you could also go on and study history, economics, or politics, obviously philosophy and theology, and then of course any essay writing subject at university, things to do with how you use language. You're very much going to practice skills of rhetoric and argumentation in religious studies, which prepares you very well for those kinds of arts subjects at university. And of course, if you're thinking, are my current A-level choices ones that fit nicely together? You can look at some of those subjects there and think whether or not you have made some of the right choices. And that's where I'm going to finish. So thank you very much for your attention in the last few minutes. I hope that it's been helpful for you. I look forward to seeing a lot of you when we start the course in the new year. And that's it from me. I've been Mr. Midgley. You have been my anonymous audience at the other end. So I wish you all the best in looking through your other subjects today. So God bless.